Hello, friends of Lutheran CORE. My name is Chris Johnson, and I am the Associate Pastor of Zion Lutheran Church in Wausau, Wisconsin. We are part of the LCMC. We also help to serve Bethany Lutheran Church about 12 miles east of us in the town of Easton. They also are a part of the LCMC. And currently I serve on Lutheran CORE's board as its secretary. And I have the great task of sharing with you this month's book review, and so let's dive right into that. I decided to take a look at a biography on Charles Spurgeon written by Arnold Dallimore. Perhaps you have come across it before, perhaps not. But I wanted to dive into this man's biography because as an English speaker, right, we hear about so many references, and we know that there are so many sermons of Spurgeon. I've read a number of them, not all of them. There's thousands and thousands of them. And so just the sheer quantity of this man's material kind of commands us as English speakers in the church to take a look at, who is this guy and what is he all about? And also, why was he so successful and what did that success do for him, right? And so this biography by Dallimore really charts for us a course of following Spurgeon throughout his life as a young man, as a young preacher, as a more seasoned preacher, as an older man in the church as well, serving the Lord as best he could. And that's the basic way the book is broken up, looking at various epics of Spurgeon's life and what he accomplished during those periods of his life. Now, as a young man, Spurgeon was, quite well read. He had developed a hunger and a thirst for reading that was something he had from childhood and carried him all through his life as well. He loved to read. He devoured books. He certainly loved his scriptures, loved his Bible, but he also read the works of a lot of other theologians in the church. He was particularly a great student of the many Puritans, and he considered himself kind of a Puritan at heart as well. Now, Spurgeon was known for his preaching. He was a very talented, very gifted orator, a very powerful speaker, especially in an age in which didn't have microphones like we did today. So he had a very commanding voice that resonated well and people could hear. He would command crowds of up to 10,000 people at times, sometimes even more, right? So he was a well sought after preacher. People loved to hear him speak. People loved to hear what he had to say. And also the content of what he had to say, that he had something to say about God, about the gospel, and about how the gospel confronts us with that great either or. Will we follow the Lord? Will we follow our own hearts? Will we receive the Lord Jesus Christ with our heart, mind, and soul? Or will we continue to live about in sin? And so many of Spurgeon's sermons often end that way, with that choice, so to speak. Of course, once that choice is made, a Christian looks back and says, well, that was an easy choice because it wasn't a choice at all. God had chosen me. And so as Lutherans, that's what we, of course, would say and throw into there. So there's some theological qualms, of course, a Lutheran will have with Spurgeon, but all the same, there's a lot we can learn from this man. And as I look at this book, there's a couple different categories that I want to break this book down into, four main categories. One, how this book articulates how Spurgeon is a man of preaching. Two, he is a man of prayer. Three, a man of generosity. And four, that he is a man of suffering. Now, a great part of the book does talk about his success in ministry, that is to say, his success in preaching. That many, many people sought Spurgeon and wanted to hear what he had to say. As a young man, he preached in his late teens. He became a preacher. He was known as the boy preacher. And he was so successful in the rural parts of just outside of London that they brought him to the big city. They brought him to the big city of London, where he would serve at New Park Street Chapel. And he was about 20 years old when he was serving this church. And so myself, I served my first call, which was not as big as New Park Street Chapel. They would have had, I think, 1,000 to 1,200 people in church in worship every Sunday. And that was a solo gig as well. So this was a huge call for a young man, and people kind of despised him for his youth, that he received such a such an important call, such a huge call at such a young age, but he took that on with great seriousness and gravity, and made it even more successful than it was before. In fact, the church was becoming so successful that they had to build a new church. And that's where the Metropolitan Tabernacle comes into play later on in his years. The church was built for that very reason, so that even more people could hear what Spurgeon had to say through his preaching ministry. So again, he was a man of preaching, a man of the word. He was known as being vulgar, but that's because there were some pastors in and around London and elsewhere who looked down on Spurgeon for preaching in a very pedestrian way. He was not known for using fancy theological jargon or theobabble, as sometimes they say in seminary, but he spoke like the everyday man. He spoke to the people in the language in which they understood. And with the growing middle class in London, that really resonated so well. And again, thousands and thousands of people would listen to Spurgeon each and every week. And not only that, but Spurgeon would also receive a number of preaching engagements throughout London and other parts of England, in Scotland, Ireland. He received a few engagements to America, but he went once, but he didn't go the other times he was invited, and there's a reason for that. The reason for that was because he was very critical of the slavery movement in America, and he was very much an abolitionist, and the thought of slavery absolutely abhorred him. And so, of course, that did not endear him to some of those southern states and churches in America. But be that as it may, Spurgeon, he had to say what he had to say, and he said it. He let the word fly. He let the word do all the work. So again, a very powerful preacher, a very engaging preacher, a man who won over the hearts and souls of so many people. And as he would also say, he didn't do the winning. It was God who did the winning through him, right? He would always give the credit to God. And I think that's an important part of this man as a preacher, is that he never really let this success that he had for decades get to his head. He preached and he did what he had to do, and he had various bouts of depression as well throughout his life. But he remained tied to what his main calling was, and that was as a preacher, as a pastor, as a shepherd of souls. This leads us to the next portion, how Spurgeon was a man of prayer. Just as engaging as Spurgeon was as a preacher, so also was he so engaging as a man of prayer. Not only on an individual basis, as he would encounter various pastors and persons that would come across him, but also in corporate worship as well, that people would even write down the prayers as much as they could with shorthand. And it became such a problem that sometimes Spurgeon would announce before prayers. He would tell everyone to not write anything down, but just to bathe yourself in prayer, listen to the prayers, and let the prayers of God's people, the prayers that he's about to pray for God's people, let that wash over them, and pay attention, right? This is an important thing. This is not some kind of performance. This is weighty things that he is doing, preaching and praying for God's people. He was a man of prayer. He loved his wife dearly. She also was a devoted prayer warrior as well. And so this man of prayer just filled his life with prayer each and every day, which is all the more amazing because of how busy he was. In the parish, we know how busy it can be with buildings and finances and teaching and preaching, all that kind of stuff. Add on to that a number of different other organizations, orphanages and things like that, a college. Spurgeon was a very busy man, but he always made time for prayer, a very important thing to remember. Spurgeon was also a man of generosity. And with his various speaking engagements that he would take on, and with the royalties that he would receive from his books and from his sermons, right? Thousands of sermons translated, sent out all throughout the world, India, Australia, America, of course, all over England. So he was quite well received, and he was pretty well paid for his efforts. But he didn't really keep a lot of that money for himself. He used that money, invested it back into the ministries. whether it was helping to fundraise for the new church that he had started, the new building that was built rather, the Metropolitan Tabernacle, helping to pay for that, or supporting the many ministries of the Metropolitan Tabernacle, whether it was the various orphanages that were run, or the schools that were run, the night school for poor people that they could learn a trade, and also helping to pay for the college of pastors that he had started. He sunk a lot of his money, almost all of it, back into the ministry. He didn't heap up all this money so that he could buy a huge house out in the burbs or something, but he invested that money back into the ministry. So he was also very generous to people, to individuals, to people who wanted to go into the ministry. He would use his own money to support them as they would go through ministry. So he was just a very, very generous man. And finally, Spurgeon, the biography goes to show, was a man of suffering. He certainly had a lot of jealousy thrown at him in the form of pastors and church workers that were just jealous of his success, and they didn't like to see this man be as successful as he was. He also did get into a couple of controversies in his life, though the book doesn't dedicate too much time to that. But what it does tell us is that he was also attacked by the press, that the press would often make fun of how people would respond to his preaching, being extra emotional, all this kind of stuff. And so he got it from a number of different quarters, not only from the press, not only from other pastors and theologians, but he also, from certain politicians, were a little upset with him as well. He not only was critical of the slavery in America, but he also was just as critical of the British engagement in India and how the British imperial armies over there would treat the Indian people. And so that did not make him many friends, endear him in certain circles of friends as well in 1800s England. So he suffered in a number of different ways because of that. He also had a number of health problems because he was such a workaholic. He was so busy each and every day. He would work himself sick to the point of that every year he'd have to go away for 3 or 4 weeks down to southern France to kind of recoup and rejuvenate. But he was so dedicated, he would just work himself to the bone until he couldn't work anymore. And then he couldn't work because he was so just exhausted. His wife as well suffered with a number of different ailments, and she was not a common sight at the Metropolitan Tabernacle, but she did her own ministry in her own way at home through mailings and Bibles, raising money to purchase Bibles and so on and so forth. So she was busy, he was busy, they both were busy. They had 2 boys. One went into the ministry, but they were people who were dedicated to the word, dedicated to serving the church, and because of that, they suffered for it. So again, this book, it's a really easy read. It's a really short read, just detailing the life of Spurgeon. And it's, if you wanted to kind of get into the life of a very popular and a very successful churchman, theologian, preacher, pastor, and really renewer of society, because he really helped transform that part of London, then I encourage you to read this book about Charles Spurgeon. Spurgeon, a biography by Arnold Dallimore. You will not be sorry. It's a very simple read, a very powerful read, and it really helps me as a pastor here in 2024 to think about, what is it that I need to do? What more could I do for the sake of the kingdom? I mean, for crying out loud, by the time Spurgeon was 41 years old, I'll be 41 in August, he'd already published 44 books, right? And so this man's output was just amazing. And where am I lacking? What could I do better? So it could be a good gut check for pastors as well, of what more we could be doing for the sake of the kingdom, of bearing the cross, being people of prayer, people who love the word as it's read, as it's preached, people who are big into prayer, people who are also big into generosity. So again, I commend this book to you. It's a really simple read, a really nice read, and really a positive read too. With so much negative in the world today, it's good to see how God used this one man for his glory to produce such a successful and wonderful ministry, a ministry that in many ways still lasts to today. The Metropolitan Tabernacle is still around today, not as big as it used to be, but certainly a huge mainstay in London still today. So God's peace be with you. Thank you for listening to this little review of Spurgeon, a biography. Take care, and peace be with you.